Sarah Winters hadn't expected the phone call that would change the course of her life. At 28, she had settled into what seemed like a predictable, comfortable existence. A steady job as an event planner in the city, an apartment filled with sunlight, and a close-knit circle of friends. Her life was neat, a puzzle that fit together perfectly, until that one phone call from her mother. The words had been simple, but their weight shattered her world. "Your father. He's gone." As the phone fell from her hand and the world grew silent, something in Sarah shifted. Grief poured in like a tidal wave, drowning the solid ground beneath her feet. The man who had been her anchor, her guide, was suddenly no more. Her mind reeled. The endless what-ifs haunted her, but the one that screamed loudest was, what now? Her father's death didn't just break her heart, it cracked open a void within her that she hadn't known existed. The weeks that followed blurred into a daze of sorrow and suffocating silence. Life, once neatly aligned, seemed to dissolve. The suffocating pain of loss and the realization that life was fragile had left her not only grieving for her father, but also questioning everything she thought she knew about herself, her life, and her choices. A month after the funeral, Sarah knew she had to get away. A sudden, inexplicable need to escape her old life, to escape the pain that came with it, surged inside her. She handed in her resignation, much to the shock of her boss, and bought a one-way ticket to a coastal town she had once visited as a child. It was far from the bustling city and its relentless pace. In the quietude of salty air and crashing waves, she hoped to find herself again. But escaping wasn't as easy as she imagined. She rented a small cottage, the kind where the floorboards creaked underfoot, and spent long, lonely evenings listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the windows. Her days, once filled with phone calls and to-do lists, now stretched into an expanse of emptiness she didn't know how to fill. For the first time in her life, Sarah was truly alone, with no one else to distract her from the sinking realization that she didn't know who she was outside of her old roles. Weeks passed, and Sarah began to explore her new town. She met a few locals, but most were reserved, slow to trust outsiders. One day, she wandered into a quaint bookstore tucked between a cafe and a florist. That's where she met him. David was nothing like the men she had known before. Where they were polished and ambitious, he was rugged and laid back. His eyes, though soft, held a certain sadness that intrigued her. He owned the bookstore, a dreamer's retreat, where people browsed the shelves and drank tea in worn leather chairs. They struck up a conversation that flowed easily, as if they had known each other far longer than the 10 minutes they had just spent together. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself returning to the bookstore more often. At first, it was for the company. David seemed to understand her without prying into her grief. They talked about everything: books, art, life. As the conversations deepened, so did their connection. But Sarah, still reeling from her father's death, found herself conflicted. She was drawn to David, but terrified of letting anyone in. The thought of losing someone again paralyzed her. What if she allowed herself to care, only to have that person ripped away from her, just like her father? David had his own scars. Though he never spoke of it directly, Sarah could sense that there was a story behind the quiet sorrow in his eyes. He wasn't like the other people in town. There was a distance to him, an untold pain that lingered in the air whenever their conversations skirted too close to personal matters. One evening, after weeks of dancing around their feelings, David invited Sarah to join him for dinner at the small Italian bistro on the edge of town. Over wine and flickering candlelight, he opened up to her. Years ago, he had been engaged to a woman he deeply loved, but just a month before their wedding, she had left him. No explanation, no warning. She had simply disappeared from his life, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a heart full of shattered dreams. As David spoke, Sarah felt the weight of his words settle into the space between them. She understood, in a way she hadn't before, that everyone carried their own burdens, their own invisible wounds. Love, she realized, was never without risk, but it was also the very thing that could heal. It was that night, as they walked hand in hand through the quiet streets, that Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't run from this. She wouldn't run from him. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. But love, as Sarah soon discovered, wasn't a straight path. Despite the deep connection she shared with David, old insecurities began to surface. The fear of being abandoned again gnawed at her. Late at night, her mind spun with doubt. Was she enough? Could she truly be happy with someone else when she was still so broken inside? Would David leave her, just as her father had been taken from her so suddenly? Her insecurities began to manifest in small ways. Distant conversations, hesitation to commit fully to plans, the subtle pushing away. David, sensitive to her moods, noticed the shift. He tried to reach out, but every time he did, Sarah found herself pulling back. It was an unconscious dance between them. Her pushing him away, him trying to pull her closer. One evening, after another long, tense silence, David finally confronted her. "What are you so afraid of, Sarah?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." But that was exactly what scared her. It wasn't until a chance encounter with her childhood friend Maya, who came to visit unexpectedly, that Sarah's perspective began to shift. Maya had always been the practical one, the steady hand that grounded Sarah when things got tough. Over coffee, they talked about life, love, and everything in between. Sarah confessed her fears about David, about opening her heart again. Maya listened patiently, then leaned forward. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. But you have to stop punishing yourself for wanting to live again. Your dad wouldn't want this for you." Her words hit Sarah like a jolt of electricity. She realized that she had been living in fear, holding on to the pain of the past like a safety net. It was time to let go. In the weeks that followed, Sarah made a conscious effort to open up to David. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she almost slipped back into old patterns, but each time she reminded herself that love was worth the risk. She apologized for her distance, and in return, David shared more of his own vulnerabilities. Together, they began to heal, both from their individual pasts and the wounds they had unknowingly inflicted on each other. But life, as it always does, threw one final curveball. David received news that his estranged fiancée, the one who had left him years ago, had returned to town. She wanted to meet, to explain herself. For a moment, Sarah's heart sank. The old fears rushed back. Would he leave her for the woman he had once loved? But this time, Sarah chose to trust. She chose to stay. When David returned from the meeting, he sat beside her and took her hand. "It's over," he said simply. "I'm where I'm meant to be." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed him. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still moments of doubt, arguments, and the inevitable uncertainties that came with love. But Sarah had learned an invaluable lesson. Life, with all its suffering and joy, was meant to be lived fully. She had walked through darkness, and though the scars remained, she no longer feared them. In David, she had found a partner. In herself, she had found the strength to love again, and for that, she was grateful.